joining us. This is part of a series on how personalised medicine is revolutionising drug development and medicine. I'm Paul Tunnah, Chief Exec of Pharmaphorum Media, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. And we're very lucky to have two experts in personalised medicine with us. The format for today will be that they will both present for about 15 minutes on particular aspects of that, and then we'll take some questions to address your particular points on those presentations towards the end. So we have with us today Peter Keeling. Peter is the Chief Exec of Diaceutics, who are sponsors for this webinar, and he's got a lot of experience, 24 years experience within healthcare globally, latterly focused on personalised medicine. And he's taken Diaceutics really to be a very specialised business consulting and software application firm within this area. He recognised very early on that personalised medicine would be increasingly a very large part of the drug development paradigm. And he's going to talk about the organisational shift which is required within pharmaceutical organisations to embrace this change. We're also fortunate to have with us today Scott Rairigh from Janssen Diagnostics, and he's the global marketing leader there and leader for their Companion Diagnostics Excellence initiative within pharmaceutical global marketing. So his role really is to drive organizational competency within companion diagnostics, which is really becoming a very, very critical area for the pharma industry. Prior to that, Scott has had significant experience building Virco into a leader in the quantitative HIV resistance testing market. He's also led the immunodiagnostics franchise at Ortho Clinical, growing that very significantly, and led the US marketing efforts for molecular diagnostics within Roche Diagnostics. So he can talk very much around how he's seeing this change take place within the industry. And Scott's going to talk specifically about companion diagnostics, how and when to integrate them into the drug development process. We will be on this webinar for just under an hour. We'll stop just before noon Eastern time. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. You can submit those questions through the panel on the right-hand side. And if anybody is actively tweeting, you can also tweet your thoughts using the hashtag DiaceuticsConf, C-O-N-F. So without further ado, we will progress. I'll introduce Peter to discuss how he sees the organisational shifts progressing around personalised medicine, and we'll take it from there. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone in the seminar today. I'm going to talk in a few minutes really a little bit of what we have seen in the integration of personalised medicine inside the pharmaceutical business model over the last 7 or 8 years. I think some rather interesting and stimulating insights. Just before I do that, let me very quickly introduce Diaceutics in the group and our particular approach to the area. And what you see in front of you is really 4 areas of speciality that we've focused on within the personalised medicine space, and the 4 areas that I think we perceive to be the most demanding, the most disruptive, if you like, to the normal pharmaceutical business, life cycle business model. And within that, we've created a strategy group where really to focus on providing high levels of competitive differentiation for personalised medicine. And many executives focusing or starting to focus on the space aren't necessarily thinking about how personalised medicine can help differentiate their assets. And we'll perhaps touch on some of that today. But I think one of the things we firmly believe within Diaceutics is that indeed is the ultimate the ultimate goal, I think, of getting the strategy right. Analytics and analogs, I think, are increasingly critical, important in personalised medicine. I think someone said recently that personalised medicine is becoming the new information superhighway within healthcare, and I think that is true. If the truth be known, I'm not sure we all completely understand, where those metrics lie and their importance. But it's a journey that I think we're collectively beginning to really gather the right insights there, and I think it's an important function within most pharma models that they reach out and embrace the right metrics that are relevant to personalised medicine, not the old one-size-fits-all approach. Within laboratories, again, another area where I think stakeholders are incredibly fragmented and almost forgotten within the personalized medicine space. And yet, stunningly, this interface between labs and physicians happens to be the area where the greatest number of medical transactions take place. So trying to understand that and understand its role and the lab and the physician and how they communicate, understand their dynamic in the whole personalized medicine area is, I think, a fundamental shift, but a fundamental competence in getting this right. And lastly, within the branding and communications, if we've learned anything, I think, over the last 6-7 years, is that to a certain extent, personalized medicine has heaped ever more complexity and confusion, not just onto executives attempting to integrate this into their own organizations, but indeed to physicians, patients, pathologists, other laboratorians who are really trying to get to grips with what all this means, what these new tests mean, how they're going to be interpreted, etc. And for us, I think we see that not just as an issue, but rather an opportunity. And what we've done there is reach out with a partner, Omnicom, to put together a different narrative, if you like, as to how personalized medicine can be communicated in the space. So enough of an introduction to Diaceutics and our own background. If you move to the next slide. So using, I think, the insights that we've gained over the last, since 2006, we've worked on about 50 assets or asset classes. And we've learned alongside our clients in many instances what works and what doesn't work, as well as really reaching back to the analogs, a rich array of analogs that serve as signposts to how this market is and will function in the future. And I use this slide really as a metaphor for a number of ways, a number of framework, if you like, for thinking about this. And if you see here the kind of a classic learning curve going on here between, on the left-hand side, executives who perhaps are less familiar with the rules, the coding, if you like, of how personalized medicine is going to work for their brand, for their organizations, and where really we observe a lot of avoidance culture and views that personalized medicine will subset a market, it is complex, it's more expensive, all of which things are perhaps true in part, but really are very small glances, I think, at the overall perspective. On the right-hand side, those who are beginning to really understand this space can see its capability of differentiating brands, differentiating with payers, differentiating with patients, and most importantly, differentiating with physicians who themselves are also grappling and trying to embrace this, what is a fundamental shift in how they're managing their patients as well. But another way to look at this metaphor is really is to say that if you look at the pharmaceutical life cycle along the bottom, is that many of the executives tasked with internally integrating this are really having to learn this on their asset. And so they are climbing a learning curve as they're working on the asset. And we, within Diaceutics, I think, have observed 3 different, if you like, stages of their learning. The executive that really needs to understand personalized medicine, they're really grappling with what does the planning strategy look like, etc. And those who are beginning to understand it in the middle, perhaps they're at phase 2, phase 3, they know that by and large their asset is moving towards a personalized or targeted approach. And what they're looking to do is to get more insight, more data, more facts, more analogs about what has gone on in the past. And lastly, those teams that are really perhaps moved into launch mode, they've started to understand it, they're looking as to how personalized medicine will help them be competitive in that marketplace. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see within this there are really a series of dilemmas, conundrums, if you like, because we're being tasked to address some quite fundamental questions very early on in our learning curve. Biomarker choices, for example, are something that a biomarker strategy is something that's fundamental to the future well-being and health of the asset that we're bringing to market. And yet, famously, there are several assets that have arrived in the marketplace, and someone else has identified the biomarkers that are right for that asset. Perhaps that was the science, but perhaps it was also a level of unpreparedness for the way in which the marketplace will define an asset even after it's launched. On technology strategy, again, we see a lot of diagnostic platform choices are being made very early on. And technology and platform choices that might be right for clinical trials, might be right for making sure the right diagnostic answer is embedded in those trials, but may not be right when you want to see that diagnostic diffusion rapidly into the marketplace, when you want to see payers will cover it, or indeed if you want to make sure that pharma, who is increasingly being asked to reimburse many of these tests, are not out of pocket, hundreds of thousands of dollars prematurely. And last, dilemmas and conundrums around lab diffusion strategy. It's one thing to say I need to have my test in 20 labs. It's another thing to say I need to have my test in 2,000 labs. It's an exponential shift in terms of organization and preparation. So you see that really is along this way there are a series of these conundrums. If you move to the next slide. And one of the things I think we would observe looking back is that within the oncology area, the oncology teams have generally really learned this on their way. And we've Herceptin, Iressa, Erbitux more recently Janssen launches Imbruvica, all of which have really had to grapple and look at the preparation of testing in support of their brand in the marketplace. And our view is, by and large, the oncology teams and the oncology franchises are getting there within many of our clients, and I think within the industry. If you move to the next slide for me. But there's significantly less experience, I think, elsewhere. And here we are rapidly seeing an arrival in the marketplace of assets in infectious diseases, autoimmune, CNS, cardiovascular, all of which have either companion or complementary diagnostic strategies. Now, our number of analogs here are fewer, but yet the tasks are the same. Or, controversially, they may even be more complex. If you think of in lung cancer in the United States, it might be acceptable to have a test launched where you're looking for 30,000, 40,000 tests a year to be run. If you're launching a therapy in rheumatoid arthritis, you may be wanting to have hundreds of thousands of tests, 2 million tests being run. So it's an order of magnitude greater. So yes, it's the same principles, but your level of preparation and the amount of time that you need to get into the marketplace is increasingly larger. Move to the next slide for me. One of the ways of really exploring how important is the right decision at the right time, and Scott's going to talk about that very shortly, is to really look at this in terms of what would I lose if I made the wrong decision. And we had the good fortune of working with Roche back in 2006 on a model, on a way of thinking about this, which was looking at what if we were able to make all the right decisions at the right time when that decision needed to be made. And what we see is there really is an inverse proportion to the value of the right decision versus the learning curves that are going on in the industry today. And if you move just one tab for me, you'll see that the team that is proactively planning and really thinking about how the diagnostic that is going to be required or diagnostics that will be required for an individual asset are optimized, that the marketplace is really ready to create an efficiency. There is a real value to making those decisions early on versus what we would describe as reactive planning. Perhaps the R&D team have said, coming out of phase 3, we think this therapy is going to be targeted, and as a consequence, we're really having to run very fast to get an efficient marketplace built. And what we did with this model was to look at, with one asset area, rheumatoid arthritis, the value over a base case, over a non-targeted strategy of getting the right test decision in place. And you can go and read more about this study. The link is there on the slide. but the key thing that we find is that were you able in a nirvana state to create, take all the right decisions very early on in the life of that asset, the right diagnostic decisions, you were potentially adding significant amounts of value to the net present value of this drug. Perhaps more realistically, where you were looking at phase 2, phase 3, where you were still ready to make timely decisions about the efficiency of the diagnostic marketplace supporting your therapy. Again, there were additional revenues, additional net present value for that asset to be had. But the converse was also true, and that is late planning and delayed planning, delayed reimbursement for your test, and slow diffusion across the laboratory network, all functions of late thinking, had a very damaging impact on your asset. So, the good news, bad news story here is the good news. If you can take the right decisions early enough, if you resource it well enough, you will be adding to the return on investment for that asset. But equally, if you leave it late, that will actually undermine the return on investment for this individual asset. And I move to the last slide really just to set up, I think, the discussion that Scott will take you through. And it is one of the almost kind of very basic PM 101 lessons that we've observed with teams as they're beginning to understand the integration, is that there is almost a migration towards, or a narrow definition, if you like, of personalized medicine as a companion diagnostic and a therapy. And of course, that's what we see in oncology. Many of the first assets that come to market have been defined quite correctly in that way. But if this was an exercise in making sure that the right patient got to the right drug, then our view and our models and our analogs all suggest that the real return on investment is hidden right across the patient pathway. And here you see representation of rheumatoid arthritis, where risk to progression testing, methotrexate, non-response testing, or even TNF-alpha non-response testing might actually accelerate that patient onto the right drug. And it's in those types of multi-strategy, multi-technology strategy approaches, long-term thinking approaches to the individual disease area is where there is a significant investor gain to be had. So I will pause there, and I'm going to hand it back to Paul, I think, or on to Scott.
Thank you, Peter. That's a really interesting presentation, and I think you've raised some really good points there around early integration with companion diagnostics, and also how we're looking way beyond the oncology sphere here. This is really present across a number of different therapeutic areas. I know we've got some questions coming in, so I want to move on to Scott's presentation, but just one quick point I wanted to ask you to elaborate on, and that is, do you see particular triggers or time points which really mark the stage at which engagement with companion diagnostics should be taking place?
Yeah, very definitely. I mean, we've quantified, I think, across the whole of the pharma model, there's some 200-300 individual questions that you should be working through, 200-300 work streams. There's more questions, 200-300 work streams. And you don't need to do all those work streams from day one. You should have transparency over all those work streams. But very specifically to your questions is, yes, I think there are stages of decisions that you need to make from the very beginning. And one of the things that we would spend a lot of time doing with teams that perhaps have only come to us at the end of phase 2, beginning of phase 3, is we're having to get them to go back and revisit decisions that should have been made earlier. So it's not like you can skip over them. You have to go back and address them. But yes, I think there are very kind of distinctive gateways along that journey is where those decisions should be made.
Yeah, so there's no way around this. These are decisions that have to be addressed at the right time, really.
Very definitely.
Yeah, okay. Well, as I say, I know we have some questions coming in, so I'm sort of wary of leaving time to address some of those at the end. So I do want to move on to Scott at this point, who's going to talk a little bit more about his experience of integrating companion diagnostics. So Scott, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Peter, and I'd like to welcome all of the attendees. It's a real honor to be able to share some insights in order to help progress the industry in this critical area. And the reason why I say it's a critical area, because we want to focus on the patient and driving value for them first and foremost, but we know also that this is a complex environment. If there are two takeaways, and it's related to the previous question, one is I would say it's very important to start planning early, and it's also really important, especially for those that don't have the experience in the diagnostic space, to appreciate the complexity of this particular area, especially compared to that of what we typically do in the launching of a pharmaceutical asset. So next. And one of the things that I've helped teams with and we're thinking through here within Janssen is we do believe that co-diagnostics success requires a new model. And I say co-diagnostics because it's both complementary diagnostics as well as companion diagnostics. And the new model integrates and translates in a new way this focus on the total solution for the patient. So the time is now to be integrating what we had typically done in pharmaceutical development marketing with diagnostics development and marketing to focus on a total solution for the patient. And that includes some of the things that Peter had mentioned too, for instance, platforms, disease interception, personalized medicine, and patient targeting, and then how that translates into all of the items in the marketing and payer mix. So next. And if we go to building this slide, we have learned, and Peter had shared this too, that there's a lot of thinking early and taking into account epidemiology, forecasting, patient flow, the patient journey. We do believe that through assessing market adoption impact, market size impact, market share and price, and extending potentially the therapeutic life cycle, these all could potentially increase the opportunity to drive value. And first and foremost, I mentioned the patient journey. We want to start with that and how, and you'll see this in some of the questions, that the patient is impacting. So doing this type of assessment, I found through my experience, is really important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. One is to truly understand the patient impact, integrate the thinking of the therapeutic marketeers and understanding how this could impact the value. And this obviously drives funding decisions as well. So this is a high-level schematic, but these are some of the things what we think of when we look at co-diagnostics and their ability to drive value. And as I said early, and this is one of the key takeaways, it not only starts early, but it has to start with what in the pharmaceutical area we call the target product profile. So if we go to next, I'm going to just go through some high-level questions that we'll go through. And I also though want to share that the format is something that we've put together, and this is in partnership with Diaceutics, is producing a tool which the marketeers could use. And it's a combination, if we go to the next slide, of an area where we can begin to increase the competency of our partners in our therapeutic areas to understand the diagnostic environment, how it works from a pricing standpoint globally, how it works from a regulatory standpoint, how it works from a marketing standpoint, how it works from just the basics of how labs work and how they flow within the industry, because it can be quite complex. And so there's a competency model that we utilize. And then if we look to the right, there's also a key business question section. This is to help drive teams to understand what key questions to ask, what level of rigor to ask them to, again, aid in decision-making and strategic direction as we look at co-diagnostic strategies. So next. So if we look at some of the key early questions at a high level, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of these, and I really am conscious to leave time for questions for the attendees. But I mentioned a couple things I believe it's been very important. And one is the biomarker diagnostic strategy. Has it been evaluated for the therapeutic asset? This is where partnering with research and development, the biomarker teams, becomes really important. So this integration of what's happening in R&D and what's happening with diagnostics and what's happening with global strategic marketing, and that thinking has to come together, and has to come together early. I would say as early as phase 1, definitely phase 2, these types of assessments and conversations need to be taking place. From a global marketing standpoint, both from a co-diagnostic but integrating to the therapeutic asset, the target product profile needs to understand the patient journey. And these are some basic questions, but it requires a lot of thought, a lot of epidemiology work, a lot of understanding the marketplace, not necessarily as it is today, but how it may look, in some cases 5 to 10 years down the road when the therapeutic asset would launch. So how does the patient journey change? How will diagnosis change? What with the projected therapies on the market, some coming out from competitors, or what we're developing, what are prognostic markers, and how will treatment monitoring in this disease area change? You know, a perfect example is for the business that I was responsible for in the U.S. here within J&J, the whole notion of HIV resistance testing was very, very important throughout the late 90s and into the 2000s, and it obviously had a very significant impact for patients and how treatment selection was made due to understanding the complexity of the HIV virus. So that's an example of understanding that patient journey early led to diagnostic strategies that dovetailed into therapeutic strategies. So those are an example of this. Obviously, we want to look at what's happening in the environment. So in the environment landscape, technology becomes really, really important as well. And obviously, we want to look at the value proposition and positioning. So these are high-level questions, but they're very important questions to ask at an early stage. Like I said, generally phase 1, phase 2. So as Peter has mentioned, there are over 100 key business co-diagnostic questions just for the preclinical phase. So again, the complexity of these becomes really important. So in here are just a handful of examples. Some of these should not be too surprising for the attendees on this call, but it requires, we believe, and I believe, this thinking to take place early. For instance, even in clinical trial design, could these be incorporated into endpoints, and what are the studies needed, which would include the biomarker? These are key questions that we ask for some of our key initiatives that have either complementary or companion diagnostic possibilities. Another really important is this therapeutic diagnostic dynamic. And this is where the complexity comes into this. How are the payers going to view it? And Peter shared this and alluded to this in his presentation. The payer landscape in diagnostics is very different than therapeutics. And when these are integrated, it does create complexities that do need to be thought through, even at a preclinical phase, because it could influence how a trial is designed. And how physicians are viewing this, not only today, but how they may view it 5, possibly 10 years down the road. And first and foremost, the patient impact. And there are many different areas of patient engagement that are becoming quite important as well as performance and outcomes, patient-reportable outcomes becomes important. So this kind of thinking has to take place early and incorporated into the therapeutic diagnostic dynamic. So those are just a couple of examples of those key questions. Value creation becomes quite important, and this assessment requires a lot of thought, a lot of modeling, because it's not only thinking about how value creation takes place, it's how that value creation will be communicated to the marketplace and extracted. And that would come to some of these highlighted questions here. Does this change a treatment paradigm? Pre-launch of the therapeutic, i.e., is it important that a diagnostic product be utilized if it brings patient benefit before a therapeutic is even launched? And there's a lot of decision making that comes around that, but it's a very important question. I think Diaceutics and we as well would call that getting hands-on use for an asset that has an intended use that's relevant even before the launch of a therapeutic. There are some proprietary opportunities and positions that need to be evaluated. Does this create a new market space? Is another example of a critical question. And I will, again, not going to go through every question, but how does this companion diagnostic or related intervention create different value for the healthcare system, and how may that value be incorporated into design and clinical trials to prove to payers that there's an actual outcomes benefit here, which, as we all know, with healthcare records becoming better and our ability to capture this kind of data becomes improved as we move into the future, that becomes really important to make sure we're capturing this data to help payers make relevant decisions in more and more cost-constrained environments as we progress. So if we go to the next slide. And at a very high level, these components, and I'm highlighting three here, are required for companion or complementary diagnostic success. They're easy to list, but again, if for those of you that are in the diagnostics space and involved with co-diagnostic creation, these are not easy to deploy and require quite a bit of planning and an investment to make happen. And the first one is universal access. I would say I could also coin the term ubiquitous access becomes really important. So those things and those components need to be thought through. Generally, unless there's a strategic choice to actually acquire or buy an asset, this is done through partnering with diagnostic providers to ensure that there's ubiquitous access. It's easily accessible. There's not hassle factors, and this goes through all markets throughout the world to obtaining the test. But in order to do that too, there's a lot of planning around reimbursement, coverage, payment, and access as well. And one of the things, and this is evolving, I think different companies are at different stages of this. One of the things in areas of disease state focus here at Janssen within J&J that I believe we've progressed significantly. There's still a long way to go, but is that in integrating the whole diagnostic commercial strategy integrated into the therapeutic brand strategy becomes important. There are some examples within the industry that I in particular think have been done quite well. I think the work with that Sabri's done around stratified JCV is an example, outside of J&J that I think has worked pretty well. Clearly, the Verco Tibotec model within J&J has met long-term success through the foundational work of a co-diagnostic strategy. But what becomes really important is that the positioning and messaging, again, meeting all the regulatory requirements, both for the therapeutic and the diagnostic, becomes very important. And this way, it's not confusing to the prescribers and the payers as to how this works. And so the whole notion of diagnostic brand strategy and commercial strategy, and having that fully integrated becomes very important to success. And then last but obviously not least, end-to-end support, understanding how this impacts the patients, physicians, payers, and providing end-to-end support that helps do that. This is much further beyond than what earlier in my career we would consider just for launching a diagnostic product. But when you're incorporating diagnostics and therapeutics, it requires a lot of organization, a lot of investment, and a lot of thinking. So I think this requires detailed planning, communication. There are multiple functional areas that are involved with this. And if we go to the other questions here, is it are these strategies served by one or multiple partners, point of care considerations, and those types of questions. So there's a lot of planning that has to take place as well. So it's not only the strategy questions, but then when you get into the nuts and bolts of planning, there are also key questions that need to be taken into account. If we go to the next slide. So here are the key takeaways, and then I'll pause here, and that leaves time for questions, is, as I said, this process needs to start early. And it requires education, especially on key business partners in these complexities of the diagnostic industry and approaches from a commercial, regulatory, and development process. So this includes commercial organizations, biomarker teams within R&D, compound development team leaders, and making sure everybody's on board for understanding what it really takes, and integrating this into the target product profile process. And this means, too, that having diagnostic representation on these compound development teams, either as ad hoc or integrated members, becomes very important. So I believe that's it. I'll stop here and just thank everybody. Hopefully that helped raise some of your thinking and competencies, and we'll now hand it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Scott. Very interesting presentation, and I think what you've described there resonates with Peter's opening around the need for an integrated process here. It's not just about tacking on the diagnostics, and it's also not a one-size-fits-all. It's very, very bespoke to each brand. We have a lot of questions coming in, you'll be pleased to hear. So I have a lot of questions myself. I'm going to not be selfish. I'm going to lead with the audience questions. One of the first ones that's come in, just a point of clarification, Scott, on your presentation, for those who are not so familiar with the terminology, can you describe the difference between a complementary diagnostic and a companion diagnostic?
Yes, so if we look at a companion diagnostic, and I think Peter used one of those examples, it would be, for instance, the Herceptin and HER2 story, where it's absolutely critical that a particular diagnostic be in the therapeutic label. And there are guidelines now being issued for complementary diagnostics within the various regulatory agencies throughout the world. So that would be a companion diagnostic, where you're matching a particular test to a particular drug. Most examples so far that are in oncology, but we're seeing more and more in other areas, and that's included in the label. What I encourage teams to do is thinking about complementary diagnostics. These are tests that may either be on the market or may be developed that would have an intended use, but would change the patient pathway as it relates to a particular therapeutic, may mean more patients diagnosed, potential prognostic markers that downstream could influence a therapeutic decision, although not necessarily be included in the label. The intended use in that case would rest more in the diagnostic label. So their nuances are probably not, the term complementary diagnostics is probably not an industry standard term, but one in which we like and encourage teams to think about, and that may even relate to diagnostics that are currently on the market. So those are the two differentiators from my perspective.
That's great. Thanks for clarifying, Scott. Now, as I say, we have a number of questions coming in here. One of the really interesting questions, I'd like to bring Peter back in at this point, is we have a question saying, how will the regulatory environment impact personalised medicine moving forwards, both in the US and in Europe? And Peter, you might like to go a little bit further, because Scott obviously talked about payers there as well. So I don't know if you want to comment on how both the regulatory and the payer environment might impact personalised medicine moving forwards.
Yeah, well, so you give me the really easy topics to talk.
We'll start with the difficult ones, yeah.
Yeah. From a regulatory standpoint, so what do we know? We know, I think, that there will be more regulation in the space. There is, at the minute, for diagnostics, generally, there are some exceptions, generally there is an absence of regulation or third-party regulation going on in Europe. Within the US, the FDA have issued regulatory guidelines around companion testing and regulatory white papers, etc., thinking about this in the future, all of which are pointing towards more regulation. And I think in Europe we will see that too, from the European Medicines Agency. What is perhaps not so clear as to what form that regulation is going to take. And one of the confounding factors there is not necessarily the long-term intent, being to make sure there are validated tests being used to support treatment decisions, all of which is the right goal, but rather that the technology itself is not finished. We haven't finished that technological learning curve. And so it's one thing to regulate a single HER2 test coming from a diagnostic manufacturer. It's another one to try and regulate a next-generation sequencing panel around the use of multiple therapies or indeed genetic profiling of patients, and how one does that. And to a certain extent, if you ask the diagnostic industry, I think they feel that regulation is a way of helping them protect their revenue streams in the longer run. If you ask laboratories, who would be within the academic, whether they be cancer centers or whether they be in cardiovascular medicine, they would say that really the innovation is still working in the background, and that regulation is not necessarily something that should be welcomed too early or in too much of a stifling way, because it will slow down that level of innovation. So I think we've all observed the very great and brave attempts by the FDA to step in and regulate, but we've also, I think, if I'm being honest, have observed the hesitation that they have with regards to lab-developed tests, etc. All of which I think reflects some of the complexities that we're facing. It's just not straightforward. With regards to the payment world, and I see some questions coming in there as, will pharma need to fund testing? Again, that's a very simplistic view to a landscape which is not fully formed. Somebody described recently that within personalized medicine diagnostic reimbursement, the lights are out, the lights are not on in the room, and I think that's a fair reflection. Certainly in the US, there's a route towards reimbursement for testing. Outside the US, that route is much more opaque. And what we do see is there have been what I would describe as early experiments with pharma funding testing, the famous sponsorship of INCA, the French cancer group in pathology group in France, which has led to funding for some of the early molecular cancer tests. And I call it an experiment because actually when you dig beneath the surface and look at where that reimbursement is actually flowing, it's not necessarily flowing to the labs that are running those tests. It's rather flowing to the institutions, the hospitals, etc. So again, we have not yet got the mechanisms in place in those markets, even when pharma does step in. Our own view, I think, in Diaceutics is that there is a better place, and that the better place starts with the normalization of reimbursement in those markets, and that in itself begins with better studies, better health economic studies around testing. And if we are guilty of anything in the industry, and we should all stick our hands up in some part here, is there been an investment in health economic analysis around therapies, and I think we've all climbed that learning curve. But there have been a real paucity of similar high-quality, peer-reviewed studies and benchmark studies looking at diagnostics. And I think it's only when we start to see well-designed cost-effectiveness studies supporting not just the test, but the test and drug combination will we see proper strategies. Until then, I'm afraid it's probably a patchwork quilt of some markets will reimburse, pharma will step in somewhere else, patient will pay. In China, it's a patient pay market. So you really have a very mixed picture in the next 3 to 5 years, I think.
So very much a work in progress. And a good comprehensive answer there, Peter. Thank you. I mean, just to remind people, if they have questions they want to ask, you can add them into the question box on the bottom right. We have a lot of questions coming in. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Scott, I want to just see if you want to add anything further to what Peter said there, but also there's another question come in which you may want to address as well, which is how early should the commercial team get involved with the R&D team on biomarker strategy? Feel free to comment on either of those.
Sure. I would say let's take a step out before we even get into identifying assets. I think the whole notion of the partnership of the diagnostics representation with the global strategy organization as it relates to how we're set up and along therapeutic areas starts maybe even before we've identified assets. It starts with understanding patient flows, where we want to impact, where co-diagnostics either can be or we would want to develop, and how it could change patient trajectory. So in many cases, I would say pre-preclinical, before we've even identified therapeutic assets. But once we are working and partnering with therapeutic assets, the partnership of the diagnostic commercial group with the biomarker teams along with commercial teams, again, takes place and I think should take place as early as phase 1. It may be relatively low rigor modeling, but enough to start getting direction. Because remember, these initiatives are going to require funding, and in order to have funding, there are going to have to be business cases and rationale for how that impacts the patient. So, short answer, Paul, early as possible.
That makes sense. And as a follow-on question, and Peter, maybe you'd like to sort of come back in on this. We are, as an industry, we always like to measure return on investment. So there's a question saying, how can we measure the return on investment of complementary or companion diagnostics?
How do you do it? Well, I'm going to actually say for once I think this is relatively simple. Within the industry, we've developed a construct, the epidemiological construct, that kind of flow that we will look at modeling an individual therapy uptake in the market. We look at pricing dynamics, etc., education dynamics. All of those things will give us a sense of where the therapy is going to go and where it's going to return a value. And the reason we're able to do that is because we have relied on decades of analogs that give us a sense that when you're first to market, you will get X market share, et cetera, et cetera. And what you need to do within personalized medicine is to do exactly the same, and that is reach back into those analogs where there has been a relationship between the diagnostic availability or non-availability in a marketplace and the related therapy uptake. And when you do that, you identify within that typical cascade that you might do a model. You identify 6 or 7 drivers. In Scott's slide, he alluded to some of those drivers that have been identified. You look at each of those drivers and saying, for example, if this drug is dependent on a test, what rate of adoption will my test get? If I've spent more money on education, will my test be increasingly adopted? And what you arrive at the end point is really a kind of an exercise where you've identified the additional or in some cases the lack of revenue that you have generated as a result of your diagnostic strategy. And I think we can see from the very first raft of launches in the market, whether it be Herceptin, where there's a very strong relationship between investment in the diagnostic, the availability of HER2 testing today, and Herceptin. Was not so at the beginning, interestingly, to products like Cellsentry, where the diagnostic strategy would, at the beginning, I think, was poorly executed and really damaged the drug. So we were able to go back and benchmark our modeling and our observations here. And one big takeaway, I think, from that, that is that done well, executed at the right time, those early decisions that Scott's talking about, is that there's no reason why a personalized medicine strategy cannot deliver as good as, or perhaps controversially, even better than a one-size-fits-all strategy. But you have to get into the details of where the diagnostic was actually driving revenue. It might not just be around test adoption. It might be around your pricing strategy. It might be around the conversion rate between those who are test positive and those who actually go on and get treatment. So it is straightforward to do once you've identified those individual drivers, and it's a very important exercise to do. I would say one final thought here is if I have a kind of an observation of how many of these asset teams are struggling with these decisions, it would really help them if they were able to turn around and say, you know, whether we go with diagnostic partner A or B, it's not a matter of the $5 million that partner B has asked for, but rather whether diagnostic partner B can deliver us 50% faster adoption to peak sales, and that's worth $150 million. Many executives are not ready to make those types of decisions. They would be if this was a therapy, but they're not so ready to make that observation with the diagnostic, and that's disappointing. And I think it's something we need to sharpen our work around.
But it sounds like there are more and more robust case studies we can use to quantify the value there. We've got sufficient history now.
Definitely. The analogues are there. There's no one story that tells the whole story, but there is adequate financial backing, I think, for our observations.
Okay. I'm aware of time as we get towards the hour, but I want to try and sneak in, one or two more questions. And one for you probably, Scott, and a really interesting question here around whether we need to perhaps reinvent the wheel or not. And there's a question coming saying multiple companies are developing drugs for the same targets, such as BRAF, for example. Do they each need a separate CDX strategy, or can they sort of work together where there's already an approved diagnostic assay for that particular gene?
Yeah, so I have and this will be probably a personal belief and not based on anything but that. I think for examples like that, where there is a particular a marker that's important to several therapeutic areas, clearly each one would have a strategy related to that. But I would say all-encompassing, and this is where I believe there's an opportunity for industry in those types of situations. And there's been enough research, and especially around genetic testing, especially outside of oncology, where there's still a need for physicians really to understand this. So the whole notion, and Peter had mentioned this, of education becomes really important. I do hope and we'll look forward to, on key ones, where there's a biomarker, companion or complementary diagnostic that relates to several assets that are important for patients, that the industry gets together to help educate the physician marketplace, the payer marketplace, and even the patient marketplace on understanding how these are used. And I was personally involved with one as it related to HIV resistance testing. And it was really important there that the industry get together to help educate physicians and utilizing KOLs that were expert in the area of resistance, HIV resistance, to aid through education the rapid uptake and utilization of HIV resistance testing, which went from the beginning of the previous decade to maybe being done 10% of the time to by the end of the decade being done for almost every HIV patient that failed virologically. And the impact on a viral load, i.e. patients, at least in the developed world, getting better, was significant. But I do tie that to the industry, and that's all of the companies that were involved in development of HIV drugs, helping to educate the market and the physicians to have rapid uptake. So I do think it's important that there's a strategy, but if there's a way to integrate an overall industry response to an issue, then I'm all for that.
So again, collaboration being a really key point there. We're almost up against the hour, so I wanted to ask both of you, Scott and Peter, just to summarise with response to a sort of closing question. And briefly, that is to say we've got, on one hand, we've got a driver of personalised medicine, which is the fact that you've got much more targeted patient populations. You can therefore get onto market more quickly and it's more valuable. But you also have a restrictor in a sense of with a more targeted population, you potentially have a smaller slice of the pie in terms of opportunities. So starting with you, Scott, I wonder if you could just quickly summarise where you see that balance at the moment in terms of driving personalised medicine.
Well, I think that driving it is going to require, again, a lot of work in getting the foundational understanding of not only the co-diagnostics space, but the whole precision and personalized medicine space, and driving and continuing to drive throughout organizations. The importance of that and how this landscape is evolving will become even more critical as we move into the future. So for one, I think it's just driving understanding of that. And then two, just coming from specific examples within the industry and as I would say within J&J, and I can't go into a lot of detail, but actually delivering on these initiatives to get the organization to see how that impacts patients, impacts payers, but potentially and ultimately impacts the bottom line. So I would say those two things, education and then examples of these in real time, real terms, become critical.
Thank you. And Peter, your closing thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Scott. I think Scott has captured it perfectly. I'm going to add one more. I think, and again, maybe ending on a slightly controversial note, and that is that I think we've been slightly spoiled in the personalized medicine space in the last 6 or 7 years, in that we've seen a lot of targeted therapies and companion tests launched into markets where they are an N of 1, and they virtually have a they're not monopolistic in the sense that there's other competition, but in terms of their targeting, they have a pretty clean sweep to develop that market. I think where we are about to enter, and it will happen in 2014 and 2015 as we see some of these therapies launched, we will have parallel therapies launched using the same biomarker. And I think what this will identify for many of the executives worrying about this, and that is there is actually a real value to the right decision versus the wrong decision. And some of these teams will be better at making those decisions. And I think that will really show the clear blue water between a good diagnostic strategy and a bad one.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a really interesting discussion, and with the questions that we've got coming in, we could certainly keep talking for another hour, but unfortunately we have to close things off. I mean, my sort of brief summary from what you described today is, again, there are clear messages around you have to start with personalised medicine early. You've got to integrate the diagnostic side with the medicines development side. But I think also there's been some interesting discussion around internal education, how the environment's changing, and how that requires new skills as well. So thank you very much, Peter and Scott, for your time. We've tried to get through most of the questions. We haven't quite succeeded, so if you do have additional questions or other points that come to mind, do please get in touch with Diaceutics. You can see Mark's contact details there on the screen. I know they'll be happy to follow up on those. And thank you very much for your time for listening today.
Thank you, Paul.
All right.